This is a discussion on global economic situation as per World Bank publication titled as Global Economic Prospects. In this, we are discussing on global outlook, regional outlooks, global stagflation, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine, implications for energy markets and activity. Underlying data and charts could be found at World Bank website. This demonstrates global growth forecasts, and it is identified that sharper slowdown in 2022 to 23. Here it is given GDP growth rates for advanced economies as well as for emerging markets. As depicted, we can see better prospects for emerging markets. This indicates regional growth forecast, and it is identified that there is a slowing growth in most regions. When we consider 2023, we can identify that East Asia and Pacific, as well as South Asia, records greater growth forecast, whereas Europe and Central Asia records lesser amount of growth during 2023. This reveals changes in growth forecasts for 2022, and it is noted that there are downgrades for most countries. Accordingly, downgrades is greater for advanced economies. In such economy, we can see the percent of countries are greater for a downgrade of growth forecasts. Whereas we can see there's a greater possibility for upgrade of growth forecast in energy exporters sector. Here it denotes risks pertinent to overall global scenario, mutually amplifying downside risks or the challenges are given here. Geopolitical tensions, stagflation, energy and food insecurity, social tensions, weaker longer term growth prospects, additional supply disruptions, financial stress, COVID outbreak, climate related disasters, fragmentation of trade, investment, and financial networks are among identified risks. This illustrates rising risk of protracted stagflation. Accordingly, it could be seen that there's high inflation and tepid growth. When we consider monthly CPI inflation during the period of 2022, it is noted that EMDS for emerging markets records the highest CPI inflation. In considering GDP growth as a percentage, it is denoted that for 2023, there's a higher GDP growth forecast for emerging markets in comparison to advanced economies. This shows similarities with the 1970s. Those could be seen in the fields of high inflation, weak growth, accommodative monetary policy, and elevated debt in emerging markets. When considering global inflation, the recent period records a lesser global inflation rate in comparison to 1970s. On the other hand, when we consider global growth slowdown, it is greater for the recent period and has a lesser growth slowdown in 1970s to 1980s. Further, in considering global real interest rates, those are negative for 70s as well as for the recent period. In discussing total debt in emerging markets, percent of debt as per GDP is very much higher in the recent period or for 2021 in comparison to total debt in emerging markets during 1980s. It's almost half the figure of 2021. This reveals differences from the 1970s. Those could be identified in the aspects of monetary policy, and better monetary policy frameworks could be seen, and also lower wage pressures as well as more flexible markets. In discussing countries with inflation targeting for the periods of 2000 to 2022, we can see inflation targeting is greater in considering emerging markets during recent period. In comparing 1960s or 1970s to recent period from the aspect of wage growth in the US, it is lesser amount in 2021 in comparison to 70s. Similar trend could be seen for labor market flexibility as well. From the perspectives of collective bargaining and also trade union density in both aspects in the recent period, namely 2022 period, we can see there's a greater decline in comparison to 1980s. This signifies global policy priorities. There are two main perspectives: alleviating short-term pressures and also build long-term foundations. In discussing mitigating the effects of Russia's invasion, there are main points to consider. Those could be seen as support humanitarian relief efforts, alleviate food insecurity in vulnerable countries, and also undertake reconstruction efforts in areas devastated by war in Ukraine. Another aspect is support green, resilient, and inclusive recovery. Under that, it could be noted the following: accelerate vaccine rollout, strengthen pandemic preparedness, provide debt relief where needed, facilitate energy transition away from fossil fuels, bolster rules-based international economic order to guard against fragmentation of trade, investment, and financial networks. National policy priorities are discussed in this slide. Accordingly, manage short-term policy trade-offs and build long-term foundations are being discussed. Macroeconomic policies under this are recognized as monetary policy. In that, prioritizing price stability and calibrating policy to avoid derailing recovery. And also, fiscal policy, there are following aspects. Ensure fiscal sustainability while preserving investment and social spending. Finally, under macroeconomic policies, financial policy has been recognized, and it is noted that enhanced financial sector resilience as a prime concern. Further, structural policies in the following manner they have recognized: integrate refugees and migrant workers, and also to expand public services is one of the structural policies. Further, improving business climates, promote education, strengthen human capital, raise female labor participation, and boosting productivity is another structural policy aspect. Finally, implementing targeted support instead of distortionary policies to respond to high food and energy prices have been recognized as another structural policy perspective. In this slide, we discuss how to coping with high food and energy prices. Correspondingly, it is noted that mostly distortive policies employed so far, whereas better options are available. Following policy responses employed so far have been noted: reduction in fuel taxes, introduction of fuel subsidies, and also export restrictions on wheat and fertilizers. Finally, measures to boost energy supply is another policy response, which is easing regulations on new installation of renewables. Policy recommendations could be identified as follows: avoid export bans and price controls. Second, to prioritize income support over subsidies. If subsidies are needed, ensure they are temporary. Third, reduce waste. Introduce incentives for efficiency. Fourth, reconsider scope of land use for biofuel commodities. Fifth, invest in renewable energy. Invest in food technologies to raise yields. Finally, improve market transparency as well as facilitate policy dialogue have also been recognized. This exhibits income growth, vaccination, and climate challenges in lower income countries. Accordingly, slower income convergence, lower rates of vaccination, and more extreme weather events are being discussed. In considering per capita income growth differentials for emerging markets and lower income countries, as well as for fragile and conflict affected situations, we can see that income growth is greater for emerging markets. When we compare vaccination rates, it is very much higher in considering advanced economies, whereas it is lower for emerging markets as well as for fragile and conflict affected situations. Finally, when considering extreme weather events which affects lower income countries during the period of 2006 to 2020, the number of events are greater. Today's presentation is based on global economic prospects. These are the recent other publications. Thanks for watching.